Welcome to this webinar. Looks like I will have to reshare my slides to get us started. Give me a second. While we are getting started, let us know where you're coming from. Say hi in the chat. We'll take a minute or two to see that everybody's here, everybody's ready to participate. Okay. Say hello if you see my slides, or let us know if you're here in the chat. All right, let's get started then. Today, I'm going to be your host. My name is Maria. I'm leading the developer relations at Unstructured. And joining me are Ajay and Tarun, who are going to be mostly behind the scenes. They're going to be answering your questions and helping with sharing links and just chatting with you about all things unstructured data and RAG. And before we begin, let me tell you what this webinar is going to be about. Today, we're going to be covering what is unstructured, who we are, what we do, what is the problem that we address. We're going to talk about common challenges of unstructured data processing for GenAI applications. And of course, we're going to talk about how unstructured solves these challenges. And specifically, we're going to be focusing on unstructured API and how you can build end-to-end data preprocessing workflows with unstructured API. We're going to cover the API endpoints that we have. We're going to talk about the different methods of using the API. And we're going to take a look of the core concepts that you need to know in order to build these workflows. And of course, we're going to do a live demo. So at the end, if you stick around, you're going to see a live demo of building a full end-to-end data processing workflow with Unstructured API and Python SDK. A little bit of housekeeping. So as you already found the webinar chat, you can ask your questions as we go along. And so you can drop them in the chat, and then Tarun and Ajay will reply to you in the chat. Or if you want your questions to be answered live, you can drop them in the QA box. So there's a different box for questions that are going to be kept in place until answered. And so at the end of the webinar, I can look into that box and answer your questions live. The recording is going to be emailed to you at the end of the webinar. So if you want to rewatch it later, don't worry, you'll have the recording. And if after the webinar you would like to have a guided POC, you can contact us for a scheduled one-on-one chat. With that, let's get started. What is Unstructured? Unstructured is a Series B startup, and what we do is help different organizations pre-process their complex unstructured data like PDFs, PowerPoints, HTML files, emails, and so on into formats that are usable for RAG applications or that can be used with LLMs, AI agents, and so on. Why do we do this? Well, if you're building any AI application, typically you want to have some knowledge base that your LLM will be able to access to get additional context. And a lot of the enterprise information is stored in unstructured data formats. These are your PDFs and PowerPoints, maybe Confluence pages or GitHub issues, all kinds of different formats, all kinds of different files. And before you can use them for your knowledge base, you have to pre-process it. Of course, you can have an LLM read a single PDF file and answer questions about this single PDF, but this is not the case if you have an application that has to be aware of thousands upon thousands of different documents. In that case, it doesn't scale. You have to have those documents pre-processed and stored into your retriever knowledge-based search engine. And this is a complex problem. Every document type, be it a PDF or Word document, has a unique internal structure, or sometimes no structure at all. And extracting content from these different documents requires different approaches. In some cases, you can use rule-based parsers. For example, if you're working with Markdown files. In other cases, you may need OCR or VLMs to be able to extract content from those documents, and sometimes a combination of different approaches. But even within the same file format, layouts can differ and semantical structures can differ. In some cases, you may have just plain text. In other cases, you may be dealing with tables and images, different visuals and branding, and all of those different semantic elements that you need to be able to parse. Now, there are certain libraries, open source libraries and different tools that handle some parts of data processing. So a lot of the time, people start with tools tailored to one specific task, but then as you process more and more data, you realize that you need more functionality, more different approaches, more different tools. And if you continue on this path, you end up stitching together this fragmented tooling into brittle pipelines that have no shared standard. Between those libraries, the outputs differ, so you have to figure out how to standardize those outputs. You have to figure out how to write your custom scripts to glue these parts together, how to manage all your API keys for different providers, how to finally connect your pipelines to actual sources of the data. When you start with a prototype, maybe you have a few documents in a single location that you start with. But once you move to production, you will need to ingest data from multiple different sources. That can be blob storage like Azure Blob Storage or S3 buckets, but that can be something like Salesforce or SharePoint or Confluence or Notion or many other places where the business knowledge has accumulated. And so this is solving this problem with custom scripts and glue code typically leads to what we call this rat's nest. Instead, you can solve it with Unstructured that streamlines the whole process into a standardized method of extracting data, transforming it, processing it, and uploading the results into the destination. So Unstructured can connect to multiple different systems of record, and these include blob storage or collaboration platforms, all kinds of enterprise data sources. It can ingest 60+ different file types, process all of them in a uniform manner with different intelligent data transformation strategies, enrich them, generate embeddings, and ultimately upload the structured result into your preferred vector database or a search engine or a regular database if you wish. All of this without having for you to write any kind of glue code, connector code, maintaining those connectors as the APIs change, figuring out authentication methods, and all that complexity around it. Now, instead of this custom rat's nest of glue code and different tools stitched together, what you get is standardized schema across all different data sources, across all different file formats. So be it a PDF or HTML or email, whether it comes from Confluence or Google Drive or an S3 bucket, all those documents are processed, and the output is a JSON file with standardized schema that is going to be the same across all those different file formats. The outputs are structured in JSON that is ready for downstream applications. So that can be RAG, that could be search, or even standard analytics. and you get consistent results regardless of the source file type or whatever layout the content is in. Of course, there are also enterprise-grade source connectors and destination connectors. Source connectors connect to where the data originates from, your blob storage, collaboration platforms, and more. And destination connectors connect to where you want your results to be uploaded. So these are vector storage, databases, search engines, things like that. And Unstructured maintains all of these connectors and makes sure that we keep them up to date with the API changes. We sync the data intelligently when it's changed or updated so that we don't have to reprocess the data every time we trigger a workflow. The workflows themselves offer different types of partitioning, which means transforming the data from unstructured to structured, as well as different steps such as chunking, embedding, different enrichments. The intelligent partitioning strategies are different based on the file type and complexity of the types, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later on. And you don't have to figure out how to connect to different embedding models because Unstructured integrates with the leading embedding model providers. So you can also have a step within your pipeline to generate the embeddings. And all of this functionality is battle tested and is enterprise ready. The workflows that Unstructured that you build in Unstructured, they scale to process thousands of files reliably. You can monitor the job execution, and of course, everything comes with security and compliance by design. So the enterprise stakeholders can be sure that unstructured data processing is compliant, and we don't keep any of the data, and we securely handle any sensitive information such as credentials. So how do we build workflows with Unstructured? There are three main interface options, and you can choose whichever you like. First is Unstructured UI. This is where you log into the platform. You can use the UI to create connectors, to build the workflows by clicking through the UI, building the DAG, adding different nodes, sources, destinations, partitioner, chunker, embedder, save the workflow, and then run the workflow from the UI. And then, of course, you can do all of those same things with Unstructured API. So whether you prefer to build your workflows programmatically or with the UI, we have you covered. And of course, in this webinar, we're going to be focusing on the API. With the API, you have a couple of additional benefits, I would say. So first of all, if you're building your workflows with Unstructured API, you can set up and tear down ephemeral workflows if you want to. You can version control your workflows. And of course, you can do some experiments. Maybe you have production workflows. Maybe you can have development workflows. So there's a little bit more flexibility in what you do with your workflows. But the functionality is identical between Unstructured UI and Unstructured API. And finally, there's also Unstructured MCP. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this protocol that has become quite popular recently. It was released by Anthropic in November, I think, last year, but it gained a lot of popularity recently. And this is just another interface to, in this case, Unstructured's functionality. Unstructured MCP allows you to build workflows and interact with Unstructured from MCP clients in Claude Desktop or Cursor or Windsurf, all using natural language. So you can say, hey, Unstructured, create a workflow for me. My data is in this bucket, and I want this data processed in this manner with this type of partitioner, with this type of chunker. And then when you relay these instructions in natural language to Claude, for example, the Claude through the MCP will build that workflow for you in Unstructured. But again, in this webinar, we're going to be focusing mostly on the API. So let's talk about the Unstructured API. There are two endpoints that you can use with Unstructured API. One of them we call Unstructured Workflow Endpoint, and the other we call Unstructured Partition Endpoint. In this webinar, we're going to be focusing on Unstructured Workflow Endpoint. So this endpoint allows you to create all those end-to-end workflows. You can configure all of the nodes, all of the sources and destinations, chunking steps, embedding. Everything can be configured programmatically, and you can do all the same things that you would do in the UI. The partition endpoint, we're not going to be covering in this webinar, but it's important to mention. This endpoint allows you to send a single local file to different partitioning strategies. So if you want to see how different partitioning strategies compare to one another and just quickly prototype, quickly experiment, you can use the partition endpoint for that. But for building enterprise end-to-end production workflows, you need to be using Unstructured Workflow Endpoint. And this is what we're going to be using in this webinar. Now, I'm a Python person, but I know not everybody who works on data processing workflow favors Python. And so there are different methods of using the workflow endpoint. Of course, we have the Python SDK for people like me. But if you're allergic to Python, you can always hit the endpoint directly with a curl request. Now, how do we build a workflow? At the top of this slide, you see what a workflow can look like in the UI. It's a DAG that starts with a source where the documents reside. Then we have a partitioner. This is the node that extracts structured information from the documents. Then we can have some enrichments, for example, an image description node or perhaps table description node. There are custom or specialized enrichments such as named entity recognition that is useful if you're building something like GraphRag. And after that, if we're building a pipeline for RAG specifically, we want to have a chunker to split the documents into reasonable chunks and an embedder to generate embeddings for every chunk before we upload everything into the destination. In this case, it's Postgres, but it can be any of the most popular destinations. So AstroDB, Weaviate, Pinecone, MongoDB, Elasticsearch. I think there's around 20 different destinations for you to choose from. When you're building an enterprise workflow like this, the source, destination, and the partitioner node are required, and all the other nodes in this DAG are optional. And the combination of the nodes depends on what exactly you are transforming the data for. What kind of enrichments you may need depends on your use case, how you chunk, and whether you need the embedder or not. Also depends on your use case, whether you're using similarity search, then of course you need the embedder, or maybe you're just fine with using BM25, the standard keyword search. In this case, you may not need the embedder at all. When it comes to the partitioner, an important setting here is the partitioning strategy. Partitioner is a node that you have in every workflow, so I think it's important to highlight what the strategies here are, because no matter what kind of workflow you're building, you are going to have a partitioner, and you're going to have to make a decision how the documents should be transformed into this structured JSON. And you have 4 different options: fast, offers rule-based parsers for text-only documents, such as Markdown or Office suite files. Interestingly, it will also work for certain PDFs. If you have PDFs where text is accessible and there's only text in those PDFs, you may also be able to use FAST, and it's going to be the fastest PDF processing on the market. But if your documents are more complex, they're visual, they have some tables, some images, maybe they're scanned, then you may have to consider high res. And this is a document that's going to apply OCR and document understanding. Next, we have a VLM partitioning strategy. This strategy uses either a model from OpenAI or from Anthropic to process complex visual documents where OCR may struggle. These typically include noisy scans or documents with handwriting or very complex tables, very complex forms, things like that. And then, of course, we offer an auto strategy, which is a dynamic strategy that selects the optimal partitioning approach based on the document content. Now, let's see how this works in action. Let me switch to a different tab. Right. So here I have a notebook in which we're going to build a pipeline with unstructured API. Now, to build workflows like this, you're going to need an unstructured API key, which you can get by signing up to Unstructured platform. And then within the UI on the left side, there will be a tab with API keys. So you can just go there and you can get your API key. In this example, I'm going to be building a pipeline that goes from an AWS 3 bucket, processes all the documents, and then uploads them into Weaviate. So I'm going to need to have a few environment variables here. So obviously there's unstructured API that API key that we're going to need for document processing. I'm going to have the URI for the S3 bucket and authentication parameters, and I'm going to have a couple of environment variables to authenticate myself to Weaviate. And I'm going to be grabbing all of these from Google Colab's user data so that I'm not showing you any secrets here. To start working with unstructured workflow endpoint, we need to instantiate a client. Essentially, the only thing we need to do is to provide the API key for it. Now, let's create a source connector. This is how we create a source connector with unstructured API. We need to create a config for specific type of the connector. In this case, it's S3. So we provide the path to the data, or in this case, it's the URI of the S3 bucket and authentication details. I'm going to have this unique suffix to add to the name of this connector so that I can see later that this is the connector that I just created. And then we just send a response to unstructured where we create this connector. We give it a name, we specify the type of it. This is S3 bucket, and then we give it the config. Let me run it quickly. And we have created a connector. Now we're going to save the connector ID here. We're going to need it later when we're going to be building the workflow. Here's something new that we have just recently added, and unfortunately at the moment it's only available if you're using the API endpoint directly. It's not yet in the Python SDK, but it's coming. We can schedule a health check for this connector, and then we can pull for its completion to see if that connector that we have just created is healthy. Let me try it again. Now it changed to success here. So now we can see that unstructured not only created that connector, but also we can confirm that it could successfully connect to it, and it will be able to ingest documents from this connector. Next, we're going to do the same thing with the destination. Again, we have we send a request to create a destination connector. We give it a name, we specify the type, and then authentication details. In this case, I'm not specifying a collection because Unstructured can create a collection in the Weaviate cluster for me. So I don't necessarily have to specify collection here. We're going to do the same thing. Again, we're going to schedule a health check. Let's see, scheduled. We're going to maybe wait a second or two. It's going to take likely less than 20 seconds. Okay, we'll get back to this later. And let's talk about the workflow. To create a workflow, we need to define all the nodes that we want to have in this workflow. And then we will compile them into this graph. For this workflow, we're going to be using a partitioner node with a high-res strategy. We're going to throw in a table description enrichment, image description enrichment for good measure, a chunker node with a smart strategy that's going to be chunking by title, which means Unstructured will preserve the structure of the document. We're going to generate embeddings for all the chunks. So this is more of your standard RAG pipeline. And we're going to send a request to create this workflow. We're going to give it a name, the source connector ID, the destination connector ID that we have just created. The workflow type in this case is going to be custom because we have defined all of the workflow nodes ourselves. And then we're going to list all the nodes in the order that they should be going in. And we have the workflow. And now we can run this workflow. The workflow has been scheduled. We're going to send request to get the job ID. Once you schedule a workflow, it gets a job gets started and you can get the job ID and then you can poll the job for completion. Now this job takes about a minute, 2 minutes, I guess, depending on the weather. And so we're going to get back to it. And right now I'm going to see if we have any questions. If Tarun or Ajay would like to jump in and voice any questions, we can have them answered right now. All right. I see there's a couple of questions in the chat about the open source version and structured UI. So there's a difference between the open source library and unstructured platform. So here we were covering unstructured platform that has both UI and the API. And unstructured library has a limited subset of functionality. So the partitioning strategies such as VLMs, for example, are not available in the library. A lot of the connectors are only available in the platform, and all of the enrichments are also available only in the library. So open source library has some of the functionality, but unstructured platform offers a lot more. Let me see, what are the other questions? Is there a way to compare results from different types of partitioners, fast versus high-res versus VLM? Yes, that's an excellent question. So earlier when I was going through the slides, I mentioned that we have a partition endpoint, and this is the endpoint that you want to use precisely for this. With this endpoint, you can send a single file to Unstructured and get the results, and you can send it to get results for different strategies and compare. And this way you can prototype and see which strategy works best for your use case. So that specific endpoint is designed to cover this exact use case. And the workflow endpoint that we have covered right now is more for building the actual workflows end to end. And We are getting close to the end, but I would like to finish to see this job completed. So I think we can say like a minute or two longer and answer a couple more questions. Can you use the high-res document splitting in the open source lib? I think high-res is available in the open source library. However, we only support, I don't remember the exact model we use in high-res in the open source library, but what I do know is that for the platform, we have fine-tuned OCR and document understanding models, and they perform better than what we're offering in the open source library. So, and I see that the job is completed now. So now we have processed the documents, and if we can connect to Weaviate, we're going to be able to see that we have the data in there now. And there we go. 182 records have been uploaded into Weaviate. One more question. Why Weaviate? The only reason for this webinar, really there is not much of a reason. We support multiple different destinations: Weaviate, and AstroDB, and MongoDB, and Elasticsearch, and Postgres. And the focus of this webinar was more on building the workflows and not necessarily on why one vector store may be better than another. This is your choice to make, and this choice was not due to any specific preferences, just one of the destinations that we support. And with that, I think we have ran out of time. So if you have any more questions, you can send them to us, and we'll be happy to answer them later. As mentioned before, the webinar recording is going to be sent to you. And if you would like to try Unstructured and build workflows yourself, you can sign up on the developers page and get a 14-day trial and get your API key and start building the workflows today. Thank you so much for all your questions. Thank you so much for joining. And we look forward to seeing you at our future webinars.